Hello and welcome to my channel. Close your eyes, grab a cup of coffee or tea, and sit back. Today I'm going to tell you a story titled The Daily Life of an Ordinary Roman Citizen. Let yourself get lost in the story and drift off to sleep in peace. Subscribe and leave a comment. 2,000 years ago, before the sun had touched the seven hills, a city of over 1 million souls was already stirring in the dark. No engines hummed, no electric light pushed back the night, yet Rome was never truly silent. Somewhere beneath the marble temples and the towering apartment blocks, a baker was already sliding loaves into a stone oven, a slave was drawing water from a public fountain, and a senator's messenger was running barefoot through empty streets to deliver news before dawn. This was not the Rome of emperors and gladiators that history remembers most loudly. This was the Rome of the ordinary person, the shopkeeper, the laborer, the mother, the freedman, the soldier's wife. It is their Rome we are about to enter. Not the Rome of marble monuments frozen in time, but a living, breathing, sweating, arguing, praying city, caught in the ordinary hours of an ordinary day. What did it feel like to wake up in Rome? What did it smell like? What did it sound like when 100,000 people funneled into narrow streets at the very same hour? Over the next few hours, we will walk through that day from its first breath before sunrise to its final flickering oil lamp after midnight. And in doing so, we will meet the true builders of the Roman world, not the men on coins, but the men and women who paid the taxes, raised the children, baked the bread, and kept the greatest city on earth alive. Chapter 1. Before this soon, the hours of darkness. Rome measured its day differently than we do. There was no fixed hour of 6 or 7 in the morning. Instead, the Romans divided daylight itself into 12 equal parts, so that an hour in the height of summer stretched far longer than an hour in the depths of winter. But before the first hour of daylight ever began, the city was already alive with a different kind of labor, the labor that happened in darkness, so that daylight could function smoothly. Bakers were among the first to rise, because bread was the foundation of the Roman diet, and a city of over 1 million mouths needed thousands of loaves ready before the streets filled with hungry workers. In the flour-dusted dark of a bakery near the Forum, a baker and his family, for these were almost always family businesses, sometimes worked with the help of a few slaves, kneaded dough that had been left to rise overnight, then loaded it into a beehive-shaped oven built from brick and clay. The heat from that oven would have been the first true warmth many Romans felt each day, radiating out into the cold street air. At the same hour, water carriers moved through the city with clay jugs balanced on their shoulders, drawing from the great public fountains fed by Rome's famous aqueducts. Most apartment dwellers, and it is important to understand that the vast majority of ordinary Romans lived in multi-story apartment buildings called insulae, rather than the elegant private houses we associate with wealthy Romans, had no running water in their homes. A trip to the public fountain, sometimes several trips a day, was simply part of daily survival. The insulae themselves deserve real attention, because they explain more about ordinary Roman life than almost any other feature of the city. These were wooden and brick apartment blocks, sometimes rising 5 or 6 stories high, cramped together along narrow streets that received little sunlight. The ground floor was usually reserved for shops or wealthier tenants, while the upper floors, reached by narrow, often rickety wooden staircases, housed families of more modest means in smaller and smaller rooms as one climbed higher. Fire was a constant danger in these buildings, since cooking was often done over open flames in cramped quarters, and the historical record confirms that catastrophic fires were an accepted risk of urban Roman life. Rome even developed one of the earliest organized fire brigades in history, a corps of watchmen called the Vigils, precisely because this danger was so severe. In these apartments, in the hour before dawn, ordinary families began to stir, A mother might already be awake tending to a small child, listening to the muffled sounds of the street below beginning to fill with cart traffic. Because Roman law actually forbade heavy-wheeled vehicles from using the city streets during daylight hours to reduce congestion. This meant that the loud, rumbling work of deliveries, grain carts, construction materials, market goods, was pushed into the nighttime hours, and so the sound of iron-rimmed wheels on stone pavement was, ironically, a nighttime soundtrack in Rome rather than a daytime one. For the ordinary Roman trying to sleep in a cramped apartment with thin walls, this meant the city rarely offered true silence, even in the deepest hours of night. Chapter 2: The First Hour, Viking the Bodhi. As the sky over the Palatine Hill began to lighten, the true rhythm of the Roman day commenced. Wealthy Romans might wake slowly, attended by household slaves who helped them dress, but the ordinary citizen had no such luxury. A craftsman, a shop owner, a laborer rose with the light itself. Because artificial lighting was expensive and inefficient, oil lamps burned olive oil, which was a valuable commodity, and burning it needlessly through the morning hours when free sunlight was available made little economic sense for a family of modest means. Washing was a simple affair for most people. There was no elaborate morning bathing ritual for the ordinary citizen. The great public baths, the thermae, were an afternoon and evening pleasure, not a morning necessity. Instead, a Roman might rinse their face and hands with water drawn the previous evening, perhaps clean their teeth with a simple abrasive paste or powder, and dress quickly in the clothing appropriate to their status and their day's work. Clothing itself tells us a great deal about the reality of ordinary Roman life, because the toga, the garment most associated with Rome in popular imagination, was in fact a cumbersome, heavy, and expensive piece of woolen cloth that most working Romans avoided whenever possible. It required careful draping, often with assistance, and it restricted movement in ways that made it entirely unsuitable for physical labor. The ordinary Roman man, if he had to work with his hands that day, and the overwhelming majority did, wore a simple tunic instead, a knee-length garment of wool or linen, belted at the waist, that allowed freedom of movement. Only Roman citizens engaging in formal public business, such as court appearances or official ceremonies, bothered with the toga, and even then, historical sources suggest many citizens owned only one toga, if any, reserving it for the rare occasions that demanded it. Women wore a stola, a long tunic-like garment, often with a palla, a shawl-like wrap, thrown over it for modesty and warmth when moving through public spaces. Breakfast, called ientaculum, was a modest affair for the ordinary citizen. There was no elaborate morning meal culture in Rome as there is in many societies today. A piece of bread, sometimes dipped in wine or accompanied by cheese, olives, or dried fruit, was typical. Children might eat a similar simple meal before beginning their own day, whether that day involved schooling, in the case of somewhat more fortunate children, or immediate work alongside their parents, in the case of the majority. It is worth pausing here on the reality of Roman childhood among ordinary families. Formal schooling existed in Rome, but it was not universal, not free, and not guaranteed even to boys, let alone girls. A poorer family often needed every set of hands available for labor, and so many Roman children began working, whether in a family shop, on agricultural land outside the city, or in domestic service, from a very young age. Only families with sufficient income paid a teacher, called a literator, to instruct children in reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, and even this elementary education was often conducted not in a proper schoolroom, but in a rented space, sometimes little more than a curtained-off section, public portico, exposed to noise and weather alike. Chapter 3: Into the Streets, the Morning Salutatio, and a Walk to Work. For a great many ordinary Romans, particularly men connected in some way to a wealthier patron. The early morning held a specific and important ritual, the salutatio, or morning greeting. Roman society operated on a deeply embedded system of patronage, in which less powerful citizens, called clients, attached themselves to a wealthier and more influential patron in exchange for legal protection, financial assistance, or political support. In return, clients were expected to appear at their patron's house each morning to pay their respects, a ritual that could involve waiting for an extended period among a crowd of fellow clients simply for the chance to be acknowledged. Perhaps receive a small gift of money or food, called a sportula, and then be dismissed for the day. This was not merely social theater. For a struggling craftsman or a citizen of limited means, the sportula received at a morning salutatio could represent a genuinely meaningful part of the household's daily income. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st century, painted a vivid picture of clients rushing through the dark streets before dawn specifically to secure a good position in this queue, underscoring just how economically necessary this ritual could be for those clinging to the lower rungs of Roman respectability. Once this obligation was fulfilled, or for those without a patron to attend to at all, the ordinary Roman began the walk to their actual work, and walking, it must be understood, was simply how Rome moved. There were no private carriages for common citizens, and as already noted, wheel traffic was largely banned from the streets during the day. This meant that the streets of Rome, especially in the hours after dawn, filled with an extraordinary density of foot traffic, all funneling toward markets, workshops, temples, and the great public spaces of the city. The Roman street was narrow by modern standards, often no more than a few meters wide, lined on both sides by the ground floors of the insulae, which were almost universally rented out as shops, called tabernae. A single street might contain a bakery, a wine shop, a cobbler, a blacksmith, and a laundry all within a short stretch, their activities spilling out onto the pavement itself, since indoor space was cramped and expensive. The sensory experience of walking through Rome at this hour would have been overwhelming to a modern visitor. The smell of baking bread mixed with wood smoke from countless small furnaces and ovens, the tang of the fish market, the sharper and less pleasant odor of the tanneries, and dye works that processed animal hides and cloth, using urine and other substances collected in public jars specifically for that purpose. The Roman government actually taxed the collection of urine for this industrial use, an arrangement the Emperor Vespasian is famously said to have defended with the phrase, "that money does not smell." Underfoot, the streets were paved with large, fitted stone blocks, remarkably advanced for their time, but they still bore the accumulated debris of a dense urban population, animal waste, discarded food scraps, and the general refuse of daily life, since Rome's sanitation infrastructure, while more advanced than most ancient cities, still could not fully manage the sheer scale of its population. Noise, too, defined the Roman morning. The historian and philosopher Seneca, who lived above a public bathhouse for a time, complained in his letters about the constant clamor beneath his window, the grunts of exercising men, the splashes of bathers, the shouts of vendors selling sausages, pastries, and drinks, each crying out there. Where's in a distinct sing-song call meant to carry over the crowd. This was the authentic sound of the Roman street, not the Solomon hush of monumental architecture, but the chaotic, overlapping commerce of a city where nearly everyone was trying to sell something to nearly everyone else. Chapter 4: The Work of Rome. By the 2nd and 3rd hours of daylight, the ordinary Roman had reached their place of work, and the range of occupations that sustained the ancient city was extraordinary in its diversity. Rome was not merely a city of senators and soldiers. It was a city of carpenters, weavers, potters, shoemakers, scribes, midwives, launderers, and countless small merchants, each contributing to an economy that had to feed, clothe, and house over 1 million people without any of the industrial machinery that later centuries would take for granted. Consider the fuller, a tradesman whose work involved cleaning and treating wool cloth, a profession absolutely essential in a society built around woolen garments. Fullers used their feet to trample cloth in vats containing a mixture of water and the very urine collected in those public jars mentioned earlier, since the ammonia it contained acted as an effective cleaning agent. This was physically demanding, unpleasant work performed daily by ordinary Romans, whose names history never recorded, yet without whom the entire clothing economy of the city could not have functioned. Consider also the shopkeeper running a taberna that might sell wine, cooked food, hardware, or textiles. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum, cities frozen in time by the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79, have given historians an extraordinarily detailed picture of these small businesses. Counters built into the street-facing walls of shops held large ceramic jars called dolia, sunk into the counter itself, containing wine, oil, or prepared foods that could be served quickly to passers-by, not unlike a modern takeaway counter. This tells us something important. Many ordinary Romans, particularly those living in cramped upper-floor apartments without proper kitchens, relied on these street-level food shops for much of their daily nourishment, because cooking a full meal in a small, fire-risk-prone apartment room was often impractical. Roman law and social structure also meant that a significant portion of the workforce consisted of enslaved people, and it would be historically dishonest to describe daily Roman life without acknowledging this reality directly and clearly. Slavery in Rome was not based on race, but was instead a consequence of war, debt, birth to an enslaved mother, or piracy, and enslaved individuals worked in every sector of the economy, from brutal agricultural labor and mining to skilled positions as household tutors, accountants, and physicians. Since a well-educated slave, often from Greece, could be considered a valuable asset, some enslaved Romans were eventually granted freedom, becoming freedmen and freedwomen who retained certain social obligations to their former masters, but could then legally engage in business, marry, and even see their own children born as full and free Roman citizens. This path from slavery to citizenship, while far from universal or guaranteed, was nonetheless a genuine feature of Roman society, and many successful ordinary businesses in Rome were in fact run by former slaves who had built new lives after manumission. Public officials, too, moved through the city at these hours. Rome's civic administration required scribes to maintain records, tax collectors to gather revenue, and magistrates to hear minor legal disputes in the open air of the Forum, the great public square that served as the political, legal, and commercial heart of the city. An ordinary citizen with a grievance against a neighbor, a dispute over a contract, or a debt owed might well spend a portion of their morning standing among the crowds gathered near the Forum's law courts, waiting for a chance to have their case heard, since formal legal proceedings in Rome were conducted publicly and often drew spectators who simply enjoyed watching the drama of a good trial unfold. Chapter 5. The Market and a Roman Table. No aspect of daily Roman life reveals more about ordinary experience than food, and understanding the Roman diet requires setting aside modern assumptions about lavish banquets, since the feasting depicted in later popular imagination bore little resemblance to how most Romans actually ate day to day. The foundation of the Roman diet was what historians often call the Mediterranean triad: grain, olive oil, and wine. Bread, made from wheat and sometimes supplemented with barley in leaner times, provided the bulk of daily caloric intake for the ordinary citizen. So central was the grain supply to Roman political stability that the state itself organized a grain dole, called the annona, distributing free or subsidized grain to eligible citizens in the city of Rome, a policy born from the recognition that a hungry populace was a dangerously unstable one. Beyond bread, the ordinary Roman diet relied heavily on legumes such as lentils, chickpeas, and beans, along with seasonal vegetables like cabbage, leeks, and onions, purchased fresh each day from the city's markets, since most families lacked any effective means of long-term food storage or refrigeration. Meat was not a daily staple for most ordinary citizens, as livestock was expensive to raise and slaughter, though pork was somewhat more accessible than beef and fish, particularly when preserved in the pungent fermented fish sauce, called garum, that flavored an enormous range of Roman dishes, appeared more frequently, especially for those living near the coast or along the Tiber River. The great central marketplaces of Rome, and particularly the massive multi-level market complex known today as Trajan's Market, built into the slope of the Quirinal Hill, gave ordinary Romans access to an astonishing range of goods brought in from across an empire that by this period stretched from Britain to Egypt. A Roman shopper of even modest means might purchase spices from India, wine from Gaul, or olive oil from Spain, since Rome's position at the center of an enormous trade network meant that even ordinary daily life carried the imprint of a genuinely international economy, something historians consider one of the most remarkable and underappreciated features of the ancient Roman world. The main meal of the Roman day was typically eaten in the early afternoon, called cena, though for wealthier households this could be an elaborate, multi-course evening affair. For the ordinary family, cena was a simpler matter, often consisting of a grain-based porridge called pulse, bread, vegetables, and whatever modest additions the family budget allowed, eaten together at a simple table, rather than the reclining dining couches associated with elite Roman banquets. Since such furniture was itself a luxury item most ordinary households could not afford. Chapter 6: Family, Household, and the Roman Home. At the center of Roman life, regardless of class, stood the family, and understanding it requires understanding the legal concept of the paterfamilias, the male head of household who held, at least in formal law, extraordinary authority over his wife, children, and any enslaved members of the household. In practice, the daily lived reality of Roman family life was considerably more nuanced and reciprocal than this legal framework alone suggests, with historical evidence from letters, tombstones, and legal records showing genuine affection, partnership, and mutual reliance between Roman spouses and between parents and children. Roman women, contrary to some popular assumptions, held a more active role in daily economic and social life than their legal status alone might suggest. While women could not vote or hold public office, they could and frequently did own property, run businesses, and manage substantial household finances, particularly once married under the more flexible marital arrangement that had become common by this period, which kept a woman's property legally separate from her husband's. Inscriptions from across the Roman world record women working as shopkeepers, textile producers, and even physicians, and the wives of ordinary tradesmen, were very often full working partners in the family business rather than passive homemakers. Children in ordinary Roman households faced a genuinely difficult set of realities by modern standards. Infant and child mortality rates were extremely high, and historians estimate that a substantial percentage of Roman children did not survive to adulthood, a fact that shaped Roman attitudes toward childhood, naming practices, and even burial customs in ways quite different from later societies. Those children who did survive infancy were, in ordinary families, expected to contribute to the household's economic survival from a fairly young age, whether through apprenticeship in a trade, assistance in a family shop, or domestic labor. The Roman home itself, for the ordinary citizen living in an insula apartment, was typically small, dark, and sparsely furnished. A single room might serve as bedroom, dining space, and storage all at once. Furniture was simple: a wooden bed frame with a stuffed mattress, perhaps a small chest for storing clothing and valuables, and little else, since space and money for elaborate furnishings simply did not exist for the majority of the urban population. Windows, where they existed at all in these upper-floor apartments, were small and often unglazed, covered instead with shutters or simple cloth, meaning that Roman apartment interiors were frequently dim even during the day, and residents spent a great deal of their waking hours in the brighter, more social space of the street and the public square rather than indoors. Chapter 7: The Baths, Rome's Great Social Leveler. As the working day drew toward its close, in the 8th or 9th hour of daylight, the ordinary Roman turned toward one of the most distinctive institutions of Roman civilization, the public baths, or thermae. It is difficult to overstate how central bathing was to daily Roman social life, and remarkably, the great imperial bath complexes were accessible to ordinary citizens for a genuinely small entrance fee, sometimes even free during certain public festivals, making them one of the few spaces in Roman society where a wealthy merchant and a struggling laborer might genuinely occupy the same physical space at the same time. The experience of Roman bathing followed a fairly consistent sequence across the empire. A visitor would typically pass through a series of rooms of increasing or decreasing temperature: the warm tepidarium, the hot caldarium with its heated floors and steam, and the cold plunge of the frigidarium, often moving between these spaces multiple times, sometimes combined with exercise in an attached open-air courtyard called the palastra, where Romans might wrestle, play ball games, or simply stretch and socialize. Enslaved attendants, for those who could afford them, or simple strigiles, curved metal tools used to scrape oil and dirt from the skin, since soap in the modern sense was not in common use, helped bathers clean themselves after this oiling and exercise routine. But the baths were about far more than hygiene. They functioned as Rome's true social and informational hub, a place where news traveled, business deals were quietly discussed, friendships were maintained, and the ordinary rhythms of gossip and conversation played out daily among the steam and splashing water. For a citizen living in a cramped, dim apartment, the baths offered warmth, light, open space, and company, and it is easy to understand from the historical record why Romans across every level of society, from senators to shopkeepers, treated a visit to the baths as an essential, non-negotiable part of daily life rather than an occasional luxury. Chapter 8: Gods of the Hearth and the Street. Religion in ordinary Roman life was woven into the fabric of the everyday in a way that differs significantly from modern experiences of organized religion. Roman religious practice was not primarily about personal belief or weekly worship in the way later religious traditions would be structured. Instead, it centered on maintaining what the Romans called the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, through correct ritual practice and offerings, both in grand public ceremonies and in small, private household rites performed daily by ordinary families. Every Roman household, however modest, maintained a small shrine called a lararium, dedicated to the household guardian spirits known as the lares, along with the penates, protective deities of the household stores and pantry. A family might make small daily offerings at this shrine, perhaps a bit of food from the household's own meal, a few drops of wine, or simply a moment of acknowledgement, asking for the protection and prosperity of the household in the coming day. This was not an elaborate ceremony but a quiet, routine act, often performed by the paterfamilias or another senior member of the household, that nonetheless carried genuine religious and emotional significance in the daily rhythm of Roman domestic life. Beyond the household, the streets and neighborhoods of Rome were dotted with small shrines and altars dedicated to local guardian spirits and deities, and ordinary Romans passing through the city on their daily business might pause briefly at these local shrines, particularly at crossroads, which held special religious significance under the protection of spirits called the lares compitales. Public religious festivals, of which the Roman calendar contained a great many throughout the year, offered ordinary citizens welcome breaks from labor, combining religious observance with public feasting, games, and processions that drew the entire community together in the city's streets and public spaces, serving both a spiritual and a genuinely important social function in the life of the ordinary Roman. Chapter 9: The Evening Meal and the Falling Light. As the sun began its descent and the 12 hours of the Roman daylight day drew toward their close, the pace of the city shifted once again. Shops that had been open since early morning began to close their wooden shutters, artisans set down their tools, and the ordinary Roman family turned toward the final, and often most significant, meal of the day. For families of modest means, this evening meal remained relatively simple, built around the same grain, vegetable, and legume foundation as the rest of the day's food, though evening meals might occasionally include a small portion of meat or fish if the household budget allowed, particularly following a good day of business, or on the occasion of a religious festival. Wine, heavily diluted with water according to standard Roman practice, since drinking wine undiluted was considered a sign of poor manners or even moral weakness, accompanied the meal for most adult Romans, including many women, contrary to some later assumptions about Roman drinking customs. This evening hour was also, for many ordinary Romans, a time of genuine social connection. Neighbors in the same insula, sharing cramped communal stairwells and courtyards, might gather briefly to talk, and the small tabernae and popinae, informal food and drink shops scattered throughout every neighborhood, filled with workers stopping for a cup of wine and conversation before heading home, not unlike a modern neighborhood tavern. Graffiti preserved on the walls of Pompeii, ranging from political endorsements to personal insults to simple declarations of love, gives historians a remarkably vivid and intimate window into the casual, often humorous voice of these ordinary evening gatherings, reminding us that beneath the formal marble face of Roman civilization lived a population every bit as talkative, opinionated, and human as any modern city's residents. Chapter 10: Night in the City. When true darkness fell over Rome, the character of the city changed once again, and not always for the better. Without effective public street lighting, the nighttime streets of Rome were genuinely dark, lit only by whatever small oil lamps individual households or businesses chose to place outside their doors, and this darkness carried real danger for the ordinary citizen. The poet Juvenal, in his vivid and often exaggerated satirical writing, warned of the very real risks of walking Rome's streets at night, from the hazard of roof tiles and refuse thrown carelessly from upper-story windows to the more serious threat of robbery or assault in unlit alleyways, since organized nighttime policing, while it existed in the form of the vigils, could not realistically cover every street of so vast a city. For this reason, ordinary Romans who could avoid unnecessary travel after dark generally did so, retreating instead to the modest safety of their apartments. This was also, as discussed earlier, the hour when the heavy cart traffic banned during daylight finally entered the city, meaning that even a Roman safely home in bed might still find their sleep disturbed by the rumble of grain carts and construction wagons making their deliveries under cover of Night, a peculiar inversion of noise and quiet that modern city dwellers, accustomed to daytime traffic and nighttime rest, would likely find deeply disorienting. Inside the home, the final hours before sleep were quiet ones, lit by the warm, flickering, and somewhat smoky light of small clay oil lamps, since candles, as later societies knew them, were far less common in the Roman world than oil-burning lamps fueled by olive oil. Families might use this time for quiet conversation, mending clothing, or simply resting weary bodies after a long day of physical labor, before finally settling onto simple beds to rest, knowing that the entire cycle, the pre-dawn labor of bakers and water carriers, the walk to work through crowded streets, the trade and toil of the working day, the ritual of the baths, the modest evening meal, and the watchful quiet of the night, would begin again with almost identical rhythm the very next morning. Closing reflection. There were no ordinary Romans who thought of themselves as living in an ancient world. To the baker rising before dawn, to the fuller trampling wool in his vat, to the mother managing a household budget stretched thin, to the freedman building a new life after decades in bondage, this was simply life, immediate, demanding, and entirely their own. History has a tendency to remember the emperors, the generals, and the philosophers, the names carved permanently into marble and stone. But the true daily engine of Rome, the force that kept its markets stocked, its buildings maintained, its streets alive, and its million residents fed, clothed, and housed, was this vast and largely unrecorded population of ordinary people. Their names are mostly lost to us now, but their footprints remain, pressed into the worn stone thresholds of shops in Pompeii, scratched into the graffiti of forgotten walls, and preserved in the simple, practical objects, a child's toy, a shopkeeper's scale, a worn kitchen pot, that archaeologists continue to recover from beneath the ash and soil of the ancient world. To understand Rome, truly understand it, is not merely to study the rise and fall of emperors. It is to walk, if only in imagination, through the dim stairwell of an insula at dawn, to smell the bread baking before the sun has risen, and to recognize, across 2,000 years, a life not so entirely different from our own. Thank you for watching my channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. See you in my other videos.